or Indonesia or Colombia or Brazil, and how they are trying to marry their now greater economic strength with fundamentally different views about how their economy should be governed and how their politics should be governed. So that's what kind of globalization. What kind of capitalism does this world bring to us, and what does it mean for businesses and leaders? I think if we look at what kind of capitalism, I'll take you to a conversation I had about 2 years ago in Hong Kong with a Chinese friend who was enormously insightful about China. And we were talking about the structural oversupply and the capital commitments that are made there and the role of the state. And he said to me the following. He said, look, if you read tomorrow that there's going to be a 9th commercial airport built around Shanghai, don't think it's good news. Why? Because at 6 of the 8 commercial airports that currently exist, there's an average of 2 planes landing a day. So if there's a 9th commercial airport that's about to be built, it is not because of demand now. It is not even because you can predict demand in the near term that this needs to satisfy. It is because the allocation of state capital fundamentally in China has shifted to an even greater degree, and we can talk about how much of this is a crisis already now for China, but that the allocation of state capital no longer is about the broader benefit of the state, but whoever is going to benefit from having his brother running the cement company, his uncle running the construction company, and his son financing that construction of that 9th airport. So when I think about what kind of capitalism, I think about what are some very big questions around the key models we have. And again, in very simple terms, if you think about what kind of capitalism, there are probably 3 models, again, roughly explained. One would be the sort of state capitalism model that we see in China or Russia. One would be the liberal, mostly free market economy that you see, let's say, in the United States. And then there is, in the Nordic countries and perhaps to some extent here as well, a model of a free market economy that does see a bigger role for the state and does try to manage some of the inequalities that, frankly, have not been managed very successfully, certainly in the United States. But I think if you think of those 3 models of capitalism, I think what we're going to see going forward is a convergence away from all 3, because I think they're a bit of a caricature. The reality, as we know, is that even when we speak about free market capitalism in the West, if you go to France, you have a very, very large role for the state, and most of the large successful French companies abroad have a huge state interest, state ownership, state promotion benefit, and all the rest of it. So the caricatures have never been as clear as they were. Similarly, I would say that obviously China is fundamentally a state capitalist or a state-managed economy, but even then there's a continuum. There's obviously now a huge growth of privately owned, properly privately owned companies in China, and even among the state-owned companies, there is a vast continuum in how they invest, how they finance themselves, and how they manage their strategies. So this caricature, I think, is not that helpful to us. What I think I would suggest to you going forward is that you're going to see in a large number of economies, including in the developed world, is really, rather than this caricature of state capitalism, is just a simple inversion that I use to think about this, which is to say the capitalist state. And what I mean by that is that there is no question that as a model of economic growth, as a model of innovation, capitalism has won, and no one's trying to dispute that except in North Korea, perhaps. But what is also now becoming clear is that the state plays an essential role. The state plays an essential role as a regulator of assets, as a builder of the kind of environment that creates predictability and accountability, as a provider of the rule of law, without which you cannot really invest for the long term with any kind of confidence, and without which you can't have a successful environment. And if you look at what's happened in India today, I think it's a very interesting example of this. The election of Modi, which clearly has political and other dimensions to it, which may come back to create, I think, sooner than we think, some troubles and problems in India. Fundamentally, if you look at his slogan, one of his key slogans throughout his campaign was, less government, more governance. And what Modi meant by that was, the problem in India is not too much of a state, it's too much of the wrong kind of state. A problem in India, to a very large extent, is too little of the right kind of state that provides the rule of law, that limits corruption, that provides security and combats crime. That's this kind of state that India has not had, which it needs. And so if you look at what kind of capitalism going forward, I would put to you that what we're going to see in a number of these countries is this stronger role for the state coexisting with a capitalist model. What does that mean as a competitive matter? You're going to see more and more states integrating their government and public interest with private interest. You're going to see more and more economies asking the state to back big industries in their competition. We're seeing this within the EU, where there is, under the surface of trying to keep the EU together, much more competition between Germans and British and Finnish and other businesses asking their governments to help promote them in China and elsewhere. So this idea of sovereign integration, that is a combination much more of public interest and private interest and competitive sovereignty, that countries are going to compete more and more, I think is going to be a defining element of this kind of capitalism that we're going to see going forward. We talked about what kind of globalization, we talked about what kind of capitalism. I think it's important to just address what kind of conflict. Because while the world has been